Good evening. My name is Noel Snyder, and it's my delight, my pleasure to welcome you here for this lecture by Dr. Felicia Wu Song, who will lecture on the topic of loneliness as it relates to AI and how that affects our human life. Just a few words of introduction about Dr. Song. She is a sociologist who studies the effects of digital culture, digital media, digital technologies on human life, on collective and individual life, especially as it relates to faith formation. Her recent book is entitled Restless Devices, and that deals with how faith is formed, how communities are formed, and how church life is affected with digital technologies. And this lecture is actually happening during a week-long seminar where Dr. Song is here leading a seminar, a group of 15 or so of us on the topic of faith formation in the digital age. She spent 20 years as an academic in institutions of higher education and is now working as a consultant and leader of cohort groups such as this one, and I know of several others that she participates with that have to do with digital technology and how it affects faith and church life. So with that as an introduction, let's welcome Dr. Song.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Noel and Calvin for inviting me to teach this week and to give this lecture. And thank you all for coming out. As I was preparing, I was thinking, people can be doing so many other things on a fine summer evening. And then you've come out for an evening talk on loneliness and AI. You should all deserve a gold star just for that. So talking about AI is tricky because these two vowels get thrown around a lot with little specification of what we're actually talking about. I found it helpful when Nabil Khan likened the term AI to the word vehicle. He said vehicle is a word that gestures at some mode of transportation. But when each of us hears this word, what actual vehicle comes into our mind can vary from a horse-drawn cart or a four-door sedan or a vehicle like a helicopter or a vehicle like a space shuttle. And he said, these are all vehicles that are as similar to each other as what comes to mind when we say the word AI. They are as similar and as different, right? So tonight, I'd like to specify what kind of AI I'm going to be addressing. And the kind I'm interested in, right? Who knows what kind she's going to talk about today. The kind I'm interested in is the sort that we as individual users might knowingly employ in our everyday lives, particularly the kinds of AI that are intended to function as a human substitute in contexts of care, such as therapy, education, medicine, and perhaps even ministry. And so this is the realm of chatbots, right? And it's captured our cultural imagination right now, as some are wildly excited about experimenting with the limits and possibilities of AI's capacity to mimic human presence, and others are gripped in fear of what it could mean when AI companionship becomes big business. In a recent New York Times op-ed, Samantha Rose Hill named a couple prominent companies that are quickly exploiting what she calls the loneliness economy. She talks about Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, who has said that Americans mostly only have 3 to 4 friends. Research shows that we need 15. And so he says Meta AI friends can fill this gap. Replica a generative AI chatbot has garnered some customer responses, she says, such as this: "I love my human-like AI companion," or "Replica understands me better than any real guy ever did." So you have these companies that want to tend to the supply side of the markets, and the data shows that we as consumers are actually responding in kind. Now, I know that might be a little small print for those of you more towards the back, but this is a comparison of what people are using AI for, comparing between 2024 and 2025. And what I want to draw your attention to is the top. You'll see that therapy and companionship have moved from second place to first place this past year. And for anyone in academia that's stressing students writing papers, right, generating ideas has gone from 1 down to 6, in comparison to the new applications such as organizing my life and finding purpose in the 2025 uses of AI. Now, tonight I have little to say about the prospects of AI romance, in case any of you were really hoping for that. What I want to focus on is what it means to be the church in a time when companionship is the #1 usage for AI. And it may not stay this way, right? But just right now, it is. And with the particular observation, though, that whatever dangers or risks might come from using AI as a human substitute in context of care, those dangers and risks will fall disproportionately on the economically disadvantaged and the poor. And because Christian faithfulness involves the practice of love, particularly love for the neighbor who is disinherited, I want to explore the need for the church to invest in what I'm calling a ministry of nearness, especially to our neighbors who are at greater risk of being rendered lonely through the systematic digitization of social interaction and relationships. So to get us oriented, I want to start here. There's this book by Allison Pugh, The Last Human Job, The Work of Connecting in a Disconnected World. Now, this is the first and only piece of sociology that I read that made me cry. It is a testament to both Pugh's skillful storytelling and her deeply humane analysis of what is happening to doctors, nurses, home health aides, teachers, therapists, and hospital chaplains who work within organizational landscapes that are increasingly driven by digital systems of record keeping, reporting, and assessments of all kinds. And her concern is that these workplace regimes that prioritize efficiency and metrics over and above relationship and presence are keeping many professionals from doing what they do best, engage in what she calls connective labor. Now, connective labor is a quality of work that involves forging an emotional understanding with another person to create some valued outcome. We all know that there is this magic that can happen when we experience genuine encounter in the examination room, the classroom, the helpline, or the hospital bedside. Places where feeling seen in our circumstances and in our very being can make all the difference. And while connective labor in these jobs might simply be regarded as, what she says, psychological lubricant to enable the real work of teaching math or lowering blood sugar, Pugh argues that such labor is precisely what helps open up the potential for a client to have an aha moment, or a student to discover for the first time that their voice actually matters. And through such connective labor, people can find their souls opening up in a way that they didn't necessarily know was possible, and even discover that being human together can be heartbreakingly glorious. And because Pew identifies these remarkable byproducts of connective labor, she's drawn into the AI conversation that often promotes chatbots in these contexts of care as a way to offer to individuals who cannot afford to pay for a human therapist or a human doctor, or when there's a shortage of personnel in a remote area, it offers them a machine proxy, right? And the argument is, well, at least these students or clients or patients will at least gain some benefit through this machine proxy that is better than no intervention at all. And the common refrain is one that sounds benevolent and altruistic. It is better than nothing, right? And while I am among the many who have nodded our heads and agreed, Pew asserts that this better than nothing argument sounds good, but dangerously disguises how it actually yields more inequality in the long run. So she draws on Nellie Bowles' work and explains that this better than nothing vision of the world is one that accepts human contact as a luxury good, available only to those who can afford it. And this inequality is evident when we think about how many people who have certain amounts of resources, right, are able to buy access to healthcare specialists, human tutors, trainers, coaches, therapists, and those with less means are left to rely on the free videos and online content available on YouTube and Google, and now increasingly through ChatGPT and other AI chatbots. In the area of education, we have all seen how public schools, especially those that are under-resourced, have scrambled for free Chromebooks or Apple MacBooks in order to not get left behind and prepare their children to become 21st century knowledge workers. And at the very same time, on the other side of the tracks, in the same town, more wealthy and public private schools are working on decreasing the use of screens in their lessons and homework, banning cell phones from their classrooms. And more than one observer has pointed out the cruel irony of Silicon Valley executives approving the design and sales of addictive technologies and services while sending their own children to Waldorf schools known for their tech-free experiential learning philosophy. So to Pew, the real problem with the better than nothing logic is its willful acceptance of existing economic inequalities, rather than summoning the political will to fight against and alleviate it. The better than nothing retort is premised on a foregone conclusion that our society's talents and resources ought to be allocated to funding technological fixes instead of pursuing social and structural solutions. Pew goes on to assert that our willingness to entertain the digital industry's choruses of praise for AI's potential to take over human-centered services and industries is also premised on misguided assumptions about the nature of AI and the nature of human beings. To those who believe that an AI therapist or nurse can be superior to human practitioners, argue that these AI versions can offer a judgment-free interface and anonymity that lets clients avoid shame and embarrassment. And Pew responds, it is not that people prefer to be seen by computers rather than people. It is that they prefer them to judgmental or unsafe listeners as opposed to reflective or empathic ones. So ensuring that human practitioners are better trained and less prone to such implicit bias or judgment in the first place is a political commitment that our society fails to consider when we allocate our resources towards better technologies. She also sharply points out that reliance on AI is neither private, anonymous, nor judgment-free, because these chatbots are tied into massive systems of automated, risk-calculating, decision-making processes that impact clients, students, patients' access to insurance coverage, loans, and other services downstream. So pushing back against all of these prevailing assumptions, she also says something about the mistake on what we assume about humans. She gets at something startlingly profound when she writes this. I'll give you the quote. She says, "By selling shame-free services, technologists are taking aim at one of the core dilemmas of interpersonal work, the risk of judgment by another human being. Yet, by offering recognition without human judgment, engineers are also ignoring something about human value. It is not at all clear that you can have one without the other, because even as the risk of judgment is daunting, it also appears to be part of what makes connective labor powerful." So here I think Pugh puts a finger on how human validation and a felt sense of recognition occurs precisely when you know that someone could have judged and dismissed you, but did not. And when that someone chooses not to look away, but instead holds you up to the light and honors your dignity, then transformation is possible. This, Pugh argues, is what we need to see. This is what connective labor is about. And this is what Christians would call grace. In the end, Pugh thinks it is wrong-headed to say that people simply need to feel seen in order to feel motivated to learn, empowered to make change, or experience belonging or healing. She says no. She argues that what human beings need is to be seen by another human being. So who are the people who will increasingly lose the opportunity to be seen by another human being, but be relegated to the conveniences and cost-effectiveness of chatbots? Who will be cut off from the possibilities of experiencing the transformative power of grace? The economically disadvantaged. What is so instructive about Pugh's overall approach is that she doesn't just defend abstract claims about the uniqueness of human beings or what human flourishing requires. Instead, she demonstrates what it is to love our neighbors by considering how the potential damage and harm that can come with a kind of unreflective AI adoption will impact different people in different ways that are unequal and unjust. Now, the empirical data of such unequal experience is already evident. Last year, there was a study done by the Institute of Family Studies. They did a survey on attitudes about AI among Gen Z and millennials. And they reported this. I'll point out the data in a second. I know it's really small. I apologize. I wasn't thinking very wisely here. I'll give you the quote. They said this in their report. "There's an apparent class divide in how young adults view the future effects of AI on society. Young adults with lower incomes and less education are more likely to see AI technology as a destructive force in society. However, when it comes to the idea of having an AI romance, these young adults are more open to the idea than those with a college education or higher income." So I've circled the part that gets at the differences in education and the differences in income. And there's the part you want to pay attention to. I know the blue is the folks that are against it, which is still the majority, but you want to pay attention to the gray on the right and the differences there, okay? So the question is, what explains this, right? While these young people with less income and less education are more pessimistic about AI in general, they are more open to AI romance. What is happening? Why are they accepting of the possibility of AI romance if they are pessimistic? Is it because they accept a machine alternative as part of their fate? When these young people look out on the horizon, is what they see the stark reality that no one is doing anything to address the often forgotten landscapes of their communities and their life chances? Is it because they already feel left to their own devices, literally and figuratively? So I'm going to shift here. We've been thinking about AI. I want to talk about loneliness specifically for a moment. So in 2023, as the COVID pandemic was waning, the Surgeon General released a report declaring the loneliness epidemic. And since then, other organizations like Harvard's Global Human Flourishing Program have joined in studying loneliness as a global public concern that impacts physical and mental health. And the general state of affair looks something like this. A third of adults report feeling lonely. A quarter of adults are considered to be socially isolated. 31% of US adults considered their mental health excellent, right? Meaning the other folks, it's not excellent. But the point is it's down from 43% 2 decades earlier. And then globally, there's a 25% increase in anxiety and depression. But just because scholars and media are drawing attention to a phenomenon doesn't necessarily mean that no one was concerned before, that there were no problems before this. In fact, in 1983, 40 years earlier, a nationwide epidemic of loneliness was already declared. An entire literature was written on this. And while human beings have long grappled against the feelings of existential and painful loneliness in one's life, what is new about the 2023 loneliness epidemic is its clearer capacity to isolate loneliness as a causal agent of negative health outcomes and lower life expectancies. So since the 1980s, I missed that one. Since the 1980s, there was evidence that higher levels of loneliness was correlated with more cigarette smoking, more physical inactivity, more high blood pressure, alcoholism, weakened immune systems, insomnia. But they were just correlations. It was unclear why these were correlated, what was happening. When you fast forward to 2017, there was a groundbreaking study from BYU reporting that those living independently were 32% more likely to die within a 7-year period than those with a housemate or partner. And what most media outlets picked out of this report and broadcast widely was the finding that loneliness is as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, that was the health outcome. And so then when COVID-19 pandemic hits, right, this is 2017, right, the mental health problems related to social isolation and loneliness overwhelmed institutional support systems. So you can understand why by 2023, you have someone sounding the alarm saying, we need resources, right? We need better resources to address these problems. Now, if you've been thinking about this at all, ever, you know that it's very complicated when you're looking at the research on loneliness, because there are some very fine but important distinctions to be made between 3 kinds of phenomenon. There is loneliness, there is social isolation, and there is solitude. It can all look the same at certain moments, but if we sit down and think about it, we can realize that they're distinct, that they can be distinct, right? So those familiar with historical Christianity and the ancient spiritual disciplines know that being alone isn't always bad. In fact, solitude is a form of what psychologists called a positive aloneness. It is only in solitude that we can be in conversations with God. Jesus modeled this repeatedly in his life and ministry when he stole away to the mountains and the hills to pray and be alone with his Father. It is only in solitude that we can hear our own selves and be in conversation with our own selves. And it is through solitude that we can experience spiritual formation. Poets and artists through the ages have praised solitude for its refreshment and capacity to nurture creativity. This quality of being alone is worthy of a whole talk that we won't have tonight, but you know what I'm talking about, many of you. A lot of what is referenced as loneliness studies are actually more like social isolation studies, where you have a typical survey question that sounds like this. Think back over the last 6 months and the people with whom you discussed the things most important to you. How many were there? This is a social isolation question. It's asking, how many people have you had contact with? And it's measuring that, right? So when you look at the data that compares 1984 to 2004, what we find is for those reporting that they had 4 or more people they could talk to, in this time span, it goes from 39% down to 20%. For those that say they had 1 or none, or actually it's 1, it's 25%, goes up to 43%, so it basically shifts, right? And the zero confidence goes from 10 to 25, right? So clearly, the data indicates increased social isolation. And we can safely infer that people who have less folks to confide in will likely report higher degrees of loneliness, right? That's fair, right? But we all know that isolation is still distinct from loneliness because we can still feel lonely when we have a partner and a family and surrounded by a lively social life. You can still feel lonely, right? So how do we define loneliness then, if it's not counting numbers of people in our regular lives? So unlike the objective measure inherent to social isolation, how many people, right, that we can tally, loneliness is often measured subjectively, using questions like, do you feel understood by anyone in your life? Do you feel satisfied with your friendships? So it's a subjective type of measure, self-report measure. And in this way, loneliness is considered a variance that rests in the space between the relationships you have and the relationships you want. Loneliness lives in the gap, right? So loneliness is the distance between one's expectation and one's perception of your given state of affairs, right? There's subjectivity on both ends, right? And so with this definition, 2 people can report feeling lonely, but one of those people can be working with very high expectations, and another one have low expectations, and they actually have the same number of people in their lives, or so forth, right? And so it is their perception or their subjectivity. And as such, there's a way in which loneliness ends up being a measure of one's interiority, right? An interiority that is shaped by what we think our lives ought to look like or feel like, and how we evaluate the ones that we currently have. And so when we read the recent findings from a Common Sense Media study that reports this about young people, nearly 3/4 of teens have used an AI companion. 1/3 have turned to them for social interactions or relationships. 1/3 have chosen them over humans for serious conversations. And 1/3 of these teens find conversations with AI companions to be as satisfying or more satisfying than those with real-life friends. So we can fret over these findings, but how we explain the teenage reliance on AI companionship, right? How we explain it will depend on and how we address it will depend on how we diagnose, right? What's happening. So if we take the social isolation path, right? I'm going to show you what that looks like, right? So if you take the social isolation argument, it goes something like this. There was a study done by Jean Twenge in 2017 where she says, teens are more lonely, depressed, and unhappy compared to previous generations of teenagers. And she notes at the same time that these teenagers are spending more time on their phones, less time hanging out in person, they're driving less, they're drinking less, and they're having sex less, right? And so the common conclusion from her study was to say teens are getting lonely, anxious, and depressed because they are preoccupied with their digital phones that are keeping them in their homes and away from in-person activities. This is a social isolation argument, right? And so now, in that social isolation, they are turning to AI friends to fulfill their needs. Okay, so that's one way to explain the loneliness. Another way we can try this is to go the loneliness argument, right? If we think loneliness lives in the gap, right? It is subjective. Then we could do something like this. We can say, there's a lot of teens that are on social media. Social media feeds us reel after reel of incredible lives that everyone else is having. This develops a heightened sense of expectation for what my life ought to be. And I'm missing out. Everyone else is connected except for me. So this develops into a dissatisfied state of interiority that results in feeling lonely, right? Regardless of how much social isolation may or may not actually exist. So there are two ways, right, among many, that we can try to explain what's happening for our young people and their interest in AI companionship. And then there are people, so this is all psychology land, and there are people like me that live in sociology land, and we like to pull the lens back even farther and say, you know, we've got to name some of the macro level changes that have been happening. There's no getting around the fact that for over 200 years in the United States, our social institutions have been evolving in ways that create conditions that increase the risks of social isolation and loneliness. We have let go of the normalcy of extended multi-generational family in favor of the nuclear family. We have shed our reliance on bricks and mortar neighborhoods and communities in favor of having our needs met in suburban individual homes and cars and digital technologies. Many of us move for our schooling, for our jobs, over and over again. And we have developed networks of social ties that are not designated to one place, and therefore we feel less rooted within a given place and amongst a given community. And last, more and more people, young and old, are living alone for a variety of reasons. So in a certain light, a lot of this can sound like bad news, a story of decline. But we need to remember that Americans have gotten a lot in return. We've gotten individual independence, agency, choice, opportunities we never had before because we let go of these things. And truthfully, for all the risks, few of us would probably be willing to give up these new vistas in exchange for the things that we are having to live with now. So in this way, many observers have asserted that with or without digital technologies, loneliness and social isolation are simply natural byproducts of modernization. It is just what you're gonna get. So, how does the church be the church in the face of these realities? I want to suggest that we need a vision for a ministry of nearness. And I'll confess that I don't have a lot of this worked out yet. Y'all are my guinea pigs, so you're going to give me lots of feedback here. But here are 3 impressionistic ideas that are anchoring my thinking at this point. So first, steady, agendaless presence. I recently learned of this idea from Lisa Damore, who coaches parents to realize that their teenagers want most from their parents, not answers or lessons that begin with, "when I was your age." What they want is a steady, agendaless presence, consistency, stability, openness, nearness. And in this way, a ministry of nearness is an embodied ministry where the church becomes a radical people known for being available, reliably available and present, generous with their time, a people who have margin in a world that has no margin. Such steady, agendaless presence becomes especially crucial when people are suffering. And Henry Nouwen points out that most of us just want to run away or fix suffering. Either way, we want it to go away. But when we do this, he writes, we ignore our greatest gift, our ability to enter into solidarity with those who suffer. As followers of Christ, we aren't called to be a savior to anyone or to the world. That is not our job. Rather, to be like Jesus, whose incarnation and crucifixion were the ultimate examples of divine solidarity, is to bear witness, to stand, and to stay in the midst of suffering. So a ministry of nearness with steady, agendaless presence can look like solidarity with the least of these who are suffering. Second, storge. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves, he made sure that the most modest and humble of loves, storge, got to make it into the pantheon of loves. While there is the greatest of poetry and holy texts written about agape, philia, and eros, Lewis reminds us that the easily overlooked storge is on the team as well. Storge is what hums quietly in the affection he felt for his gardener, the friendly greetings I exchange daily with my office mates, and the low-key banter I enjoy with the barista who is always there at 7 a.m. on Thursday morning. All of these seemingly light human interactions are actually profoundly meaningful to the texture of our lives, often inoculating us from feelings of loneliness without us even knowing it. Even when we have been half-hearted or preoccupied in our interactions with the gardener, the office mate, or the barista, maybe we have been somehow reminded, as Kathleen Norris put it, that we exist for each other. And when we're at a low ebb, sometimes just to see the goodness radiating from another can be all we need in order to rediscover it ourselves. I know I personally learned the value of these happenstance encounters during the pandemic because they became scarce. I felt the loss of these storge ties and wondered about how they might actually function like an unsung holy vitamin that sustains our souls. And as a church, how do we train ourselves to better value and actively participate in such quotidian encounters in a world not only increasingly beset with AI as human substitutes, but also lacking in institutional resources for cultivating a quality of existential resonance that we all seek in life? So how do we cultivate this storge love for our neighbors, again, especially for those otherwise invisible to everyone else in society? And then my last is faithful presence. When we live in a pluralistic society, the truth is it might not be enough just to be near and have margin, keep an open heart to developing storge love. We might actually need to invest some sweat equity into better understanding how it is that some people in our society, due to their race, class, disability, language, age, immigration status, face a constant struggle of having to repeatedly navigate feeling unseen or misrecognized. Whether it is the deaths of despair, the opioid crisis, or the Black Lives Matter movement, These are all cries of pain coming from those who feel invisible, misrecognized, all deeply longing to be seen and heard. And here I find it helpful to return to James Hunter's understanding of faithful presence, being one that actively engages otherness and believes in how our collective wholeness is only possible when we genuinely accept each other in our differences. He writes this. He says, "Scriptures does not teach that the stranger is not strange to us or that the differences among us are somehow insignificant. But however different, the stranger or the other represents neither metaphysical danger nor darkness." The call to faithful presence is a call to being committed to the other, the one who we would otherwise be estranged from, in a way that does not minimize the genuine differences that exist. And as such, faithful presence is an informed presence that has done the work, or at least understands the need to get on the journey of doing the work, of acknowledging how our social locations shape our understanding and experience of the world. Doing that work looks like humbly learning and being curious about this true strangeness of others and the true strangeness of ourselves. And what compels us and empowers us to do this work of reaching out in our experience of God's willingness is God's willingness to reach out and love us in all of our strangeness first. So in this way, the ministry of nearness is work that we need to put our shoulder into. It is something that requires a humble willingness to be renewed and stretched as a human being. So in a world where a key casualty of our growing dependence on AI is a future where loneliness not only increases, but becomes more stratified, where at-risk populations have less access to experiencing the unique resonance of human encounter, we as the church have a unique set of resources for honoring our neighbor's dignity by offering a steady, agendaless, faithful presence. So to close, I'd like to read a passage from Cole Arthur Riley, who paints a moving picture of God's love for us and how God models the kind of grace that makes the plight of our human condition a little less lonely. It goes like this. On the day the world began to die, God became a seamstress. When Eve and Adam eat from the tree, and decay and despair begin to creep in, when they learn to hide from their own bodies, when they learn to hide from each other. No one ever told me the story of a God who kneels and makes clothes out of animal skin for them. In the garden, when shame had replaced Eve's and Adam's dignity, God became a seamstress. He took the skin off of his creation to make something that would allow humans to stand in the presence of their maker and one another again. Isn't it strange that God didn't just tell Adam and Eve to come out of hiding and stop being silly? Because he's the one who made them, and he has seen every part of them. He doesn't say that in the story, or at least we do not know if he did. But we do know that God went to great lengths to help them stand unashamed. Sometimes you can't talk someone into believing their dignity. You do what you can to make a person feel unashamed of themselves. And you hope in time they'll believe in their beauty all on their own. Maybe the same hand that made garments for a trembling Adam and Eve is doing something he can that we might come a little closer. I pray his stitches hold. Thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming, and just to say that Dr. Song will be around for any of you who have any questions or responses and want to talk further. But other than that, I would just want to give you a blessing to go, and thank you for coming.